I would like to share some things that I found when I was looking into some issues on freedom of conscience, some historical things that were quite fascinating. Um, I read some interesting books that were written back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. I have a list of some of them here. You'll recognize some of the names. A.T. Jones, Josiah Strong, Ellen White. I also looked into a lot of information on Wikipedia and found some interesting things. So I'd like to share some of that with you to make you aware of where we have been in America and possibly where we're going. Jesus said a couple of principles that have to do with freedom of conscience. In Mark 12:17, he said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And then in John 18:36, he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." And these principles will show up a little later in some of the things that I share here. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of this. Back in 1530, the Diet of Augsburg or Diet of Spires, I'm not sure what the official name of it was, but that was kind of the beginning of the Protestant movement. That's when Protestants were first called Protestants, and in their presentation to the authorities at that time, they had what we know of as the Augsburg Confession. And in that Augsburg Confession, there are some things that are specifically related to freedom of conscience. Article number 28 says, "The power of the church and the civil power must not be confounded. The power of the church has its own commission to teach the gospel and to administer the sacraments. Let it not break into the office of another. Let it not transfer the kingdoms of this world. Let it not abrogate the laws of civil rulers. Let it not abolish laws to civil rulers concerning, let it not abolish lawful obedience. Let it not interfere with judgments concerning civil ordinances or contracts. Let it not prescribe laws to civil rulers concerning the form of the commonwealth. As Christ says, John 18:33, my kingdom is not of this world. Also Luke 12:14, who made me a judge or divider over you? Paul also says, Philippians 3:20, our citizenship is in heaven. And in 2 Corinthians 10:4, we can read, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the casting down of imaginations. And one of the significant persons that was involved there was Christian Bayer. I think that's how you pronounce his name. He was a chancellor of Saxony. He was asked to read the Augsburg Confession to the dignitaries that were there. And when he had finished reading it, he added this personal comment. We must take particular care not to mingle the power of the church with the power of the state. The power of the church ought never to invade an office that is foreign to it, for Christ himself said, my kingdom is not of this world. And again, who made me a judge over you? St. Paul said to the Philippians, our citizenship is in heaven, and to the Corinthians, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God. It is thus that we distinguish the two governments and the two powers, and that we honor both as the most excellent gifts that God has given here on earth. And that comes from Merle d'Aubigné, History of the Reformation of the 16th century. So that's quite a well-known historical book. Well, that was in 1530. About 80 years later, we had America getting started, and this is one of the things that was early on. America's first Sunday law, 1610, in the Virginia colony. Every man and woman shall repair in the morning to the divine service, and sermons preached upon the Sabbath, which is Sunday in their mind, and in the afternoon to divine service and catechizing, upon pain for the first fault to lose their provision and allowance for the whole week following, for the second to lose the said allowance and also be whipped, and for the third to suffer death. So that was pretty strict and pretty definite about what they were expecting. And this is a note from American State Papers, which is actually a book of various Sunday law issues written back in the early 1900s. The first settlers of Virginia were immigrants from England of the English Church, just at a point in time when it was flushed with complete victory over the religions of all other persuasions. Possessed as they became of the powers of making, administering, and executing the laws, they showed equal intolerance in this country. So they didn't like the intolerance they had in Europe, so they came over here, but they did the same thing over here. They showed the equal intolerance in this country with their Presbyterian brethren who had immigrated to the northern government. Several acts of the Virginia Assembly of 1659, 1662, and 1693 had made it penal in parents to refuse to have their children baptized, had prohibited the unlawful assembling of Quakers, had made it penal for children or for any master of a vessel to bring a Quaker into the state, had ordered those already there and such as should come thereafter to be imprisoned till they should abjure the country, provided a milder penalty for the first and second term, but death for their third. And then it mentions in the same year, 1610, a law was enacted in Virginia against blasphemy, the offender for the first offense to suffer severe punishment, for the second to have a bodkin thrust through his tongue, and for the third be brought to a martial court and there receive censure of death. Similar laws, both as regards Sunday observance and blasphemy, were enacted by Massachusetts in 1698, by Connecticut about the same time, and by Maryland in 1723. So we see that there was not really religious freedom in this country. Okay, thinking about the separatists. The separatists were English Protestants who separated from the Church of England in the early 1600s because they believed that true churches were voluntary, democratic communities, not whole Christian nations, and that their worship should be independent of the traditions and organization of a central church. They were persecuted so much that they fled to Holland and finally to the New World as a group that became known as Pilgrims. They landed at Plymouth, New England in November of 1620 and founded the Plymouth colony with John Carver as governor. It was the desire for liberty of conscience that inspired the Pilgrims to brave the perils of the long journey across the sea, to endure the hardships and dangers of the wilderness, and with God's blessing to lay on the shores of America the foundation of a mighty nation. Yet, honest and God-fearing as they were, the Pilgrims did not yet comprehend the great principle of religious freedom. The freedom which they sacrificed so much to secure for themselves, they were not equally ready to grant to others. That's from the Great Controversy. Now we look at the Puritans. The Puritans were English Protestants who wanted to purify the Church of England of all Roman Catholic practices. They believed that the Church of England had not been fully reformed and needed to become more Protestant. They advocated greater purity of worship and doctrine, as well as personal and corporate piety. In the 1620s, they saw indications in the religious and political climate of England that gave little hope of real reformation. The success of the Plymouth colony, which was the Pilgrims, suggested an opportunity for them to establish a real Puritan government. In 1628, a company of 60 Puritans established Massachusetts colony at Salem on Massachusetts Bay with John Endicott as their governor. A Puritan or Calvinistic government was at once established and put into working order. A church was organized according to the congregational form. As other immigrants continued to arrive, it wasn't long until trouble started. Not everyone was inclined to Puritanism. Two persons of the former Company of Salem, John and Samuel Brown, took the lead in worshiping according to their own wish, conducting their service after the Episcopal order, using the Book of Common Prayer. Their worship was forbidden. The Browns were rebuked as separatists. Their defense was pronounced sedition. Their worship was declared mutiny, and they were sent back to England as factious and evil-conditioned men. John Endicott declared that New England was no place for such as they. Here we have a quote by John Cotton, who was one of the early pastors of the Boston Church. He said, "Persecution is not wrong in itself. It is wicked for falsehood to persecute truth, but it is the sacred duty of truth to persecute falsehood." This is John Winthrop, the third governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and this is what he said. We have come to New England in order to make a society after our own model. All who agree with us may come and join that society. Those who disagree may go elsewhere. There is room enough on the American continent. So they were not very tolerant. Here we have a quote from a sermon by Samuel Shepherd, a minister of Charlestown, which was a suburb of Boston. He said, "Let the magistrate's coercive power in matters of religion, therefore, be still asserted, seeing he is one who is bound to God more than any other man to cherish his true religion. And how woeful would the state of things soon be among us if men might have liberty without control to profess or preach or print or publish what they list, tending to the seduction of others." Apparently he did not believe in freedom of speech or freedom of several other things, freedom of press and those kind of things. In 1631, the following law was enacted. To the end this body of the commons may be preserved of honest and good men, it is ordered and agreed that for the time to come no man shall be admitted to the freedom of this body politic, but such as are members of some of the churches within the limits of the same. It was also specified in the laws of all the colonies that any civil leader must be a member of one of the accepted churches. And if you weren't one of the accepted churches in that area, you were pushed out. Here's kind of an interesting and almost humorous little side note, but it kind of does explain a little bit about some of their ideas. There was a person called the Tithing Man, and he had a certain amount of authority, he did quite a bit of work in those communities, but I'll just read a description of some of what the Tithing Man did. The most grotesque, the most extraordinary, the most highly colored figure in the dull New England church life was the Tithing Man. This absurd and distorted type of the English church beadle, which a beadle was a parish officer whose business is to punish petty offenders, this colonial sleep banisher was equipped with a long staff, heavily knobbed at one end, with which he severely and pitilessly rapped wrapped the heads of the two sleepy men and the two wide-awake boys. From the other end of this wand of office depended a long foxtail or a hare's foot, which he softly thrust in the faces of the sleeping Priscillas, Charities, and Hopestills, and which gently brushed and tickled them into reverent but startled wakefulness. One zealous but too impetuous tithing man, in his pious ardor of office, inadvertently applied the wrong end, the end with the heavy knob, the masculine end, to a drowsy matron's head, and for this severely ungallant mistake he was cautioned by the ruling elders to thereafter use more discressing and less haste. Another catastrophe from too fierce of a zeal on the part of the tithing man is recorded. An old farmer, worn out with a hard Saturday's work of sheep washing, fell asleep ere the hourglass had once been turned, though he was a man of dignity, for he sat in his own pew, which if they could pay the rent on their pew, they had their own private spot to sit. He could not escape the rod of the pragmatical tithing man. Being rudely disturbed, but not wholly wakened, the bewildered sheep farmer sprung to his feet, seized his astonished and mortified wife by the shoulders, and shook her violently, shouting at the top of his voice, haw back, stand still, will you?" Poor good man and good wife, many years elapsed ere they recovered from that keen disgrace. The tithing man also watched to see that no young people walked abroad on the eve of the Sabbath, that is, on a Saturday night. He also marked and reported all those who lie at home, and others who profanely behaved, lingered without doors at meeting time on the Lord's day. All the sons of Belial strutting about, setting on fences, and otherwise desecrating the day. So it was his job to patrol the streets and make sure that everybody did what they were supposed to do. Great and small alike were under his control, as this notice from the Columbian Sentinel of December 1789 abundantly proves. It is entitled, "The President and the Tithing Man." The President, which was George Washington, on his return to New York from his late tour through Connecticut, having missed his way on Saturday, was obliged to ride a few miles on Sunday morning in order to gain the town at which he had previously proposed to have attended divine service. Before he arrived, however, he was met by a tithing man, who commanded him to stop, demanded the occasion of his riding, and it was not until the president had informed him of every circumstance and promised to go no farther than the town intended that the tithing man would permit him to proceed on his journey. That comes from a book called The Sabbath in Puritan New England, which is a very interesting and enlightening book to read. About this time, Roger Williams arrived. He accepted a call to be the pastor of the Salem Church. He soon was at odds with the civil leaders because he denounced their laws making church membership a qualification for office and enforcing religious observances. He declared that the worst law in the English code was that by which they themselves, when in England, had been compelled to attend the parish church. He reproved their inconsistency in counting that persecution in England and then doing the same things themselves in New England. In 1635, the General Court sentenced him to exile. In January of 1636, they attempted to force him to return to England, but he escaped into the wilderness. For more than 3 months, he had to survive the severe winter with hardly any food and little shelter except possibly a hollow tree. He was finally taken in by Massasoit, chief of the Poconocots. He said, "The ravens fed me in the wilderness." That spring, he and some others began a new settlement on some land he had purchased from Massasoit, and he did believe that white people, Europeans, should be fair with the Indians, and so he purchased that land from the chief. But the authorities from Plymouth Colony objected, claiming that he was within their land grant. Even though he and his friends had already planted their crops, they decided to move across the river. He acquired land from some other native tribes and established Providence, Rhode Island, the first place in modern history where citizenship and religion were separate, providing religious liberty and separation of church and state. Here are some things that Roger Williams had to say. The magistrate should not punish a breach of the Sabbath nor any other religious offense, as it was a breach of the first table of the law, comprised in the first 4 of the commandments. And at that time, they kind of had the idea that the first 4 commandments had to do with your relationship with God, the last 6 with your relationship with those around you. And so here he's saying the civil government should not meddle in the first 4 commandments. And he said, "Man is accountable to his Maker alone for his religious opinions and practices, and is entitled to unrestrained liberty to maintain and enjoy them." Well, while these colonies were being settled, someone thought that the Catholics were being too much persecuted in Europe, and so the province of Maryland was chartered on June 20th, 1632, for the purpose of providing religious toleration of England's Roman Catholic minority. Although Maryland was the most heavily Catholic of the England mainland colonies, they were still in the minority, consisting of less than 10% of the total population. So the colony was started for the purpose of giving Catholics religious freedom, but there were many others in the colony also, which later caused problems. In 1642, a number of Puritans left Virginia for Maryland and founded Providence, which is now Annapolis. In 1644, a dispute over some trading issues resulted in St. Mary's City, the capital, being taken over by Puritans, which was a politician named William Claiborne and a pirate, Richard Ingle. Both of them used religion as a tool to gain popular support. They captured Jesuit priests, imprisoned them, and sent them back to England. In 1646, order was restored, and the Act Concerning Religion in 1649 granted religious liberty to all Trinitarian Christians. In 1650, the Puritans revolted against the proprietary government. Protestants swept the Catholics out of the legislature, and religious strife returned. The Puritans set up a new government prohibiting both Roman Catholicism and Anglicanism. Mobs burned down all the original Catholic churches of southern Maryland. The Puritan rule lasted until 1658, when the Calvert family and Lord Baltimore regained proprietary control and reenacted the Toleration Act. Maryland outlawed Catholicism in 1688. In 1704, the Maryland General Assembly prohibited Catholics from operating schools, limited the corporate ownership of property to hamper religious orders from expanding or supporting themselves, and encouraged the conversion of Catholic children. The celebration of the Catholic sacraments was also officially restricted. Basically, the concepts in those times were, I am in the right, you are in the wrong. When you are the stronger, you ought to tolerate me, for it is your duty to tolerate truth. But when I am the stronger, I shall persecute you, for it is my duty to persecute error. That's an interesting concept. Anne Hutchinson came to Massachusetts colony in 1636. She began holding meetings with other women at her house to talk over the sermons they heard, sort of a little private Bible study. But, as was natural, they drifted into the discussion of the ministers rather than their sermons. In one of these meetings, Mrs. Hutchinson happened to remark that, of the ministers, none did preach the covenant of free grace but Master Cotton, and that they had not the seal of the Spirit, and so were not able ministers of the New Testament. This remark soon got into circulation among the preachers, and of course was not at all palatable. For this remark, Anne Hutchinson was brought to trial in November of 1637. John Winthrop was the judge, and she was not granted a jury. She was pregnant and not in good health, but was forced to stand through 2 long days of biased investigation. The final verdict was, Governor Winthrop said, Mrs. Hutchinson, the sentence of the court you hear is that you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman not fit for our society and are to be imprisoned till the court shall send you away. Mrs. Hutchinson responded, I desire to know wherefore I am banished. And the governor said, Say no more. The court knows wherefore and is satisfied. So she couldn't speak for herself. Fortunately, she, with some of her friends, was able to escape to Rhode Island at the invitation of Roger Williams. There was hostility against Catholics, against various other ones, and also against Baptists, which they were started out being known as Anabaptists. The General Court of Massachusetts in 1644 ordered and agreed that if any person or persons within this jurisdiction shall either openly condemn or oppose the baptizing of infants, or go about secretly to seduce others from the approbation or use thereof, or shall purposely depart the congregation at the ministration of the ordinance, or deny the ordinance of magistracy, or their lawful right and authority to make war, or to punish the outward breaches of the first table, and shall appear to the court willfully and obstinately to continue therein, after due time and means of conviction, each such or every such person or persons shall be sentenced to banishment. In 1651, 3 Baptist ministers, John Clark, Obadiah Holmes, and John Crandall, went from the Providence Plantation to Lynn, Massachusetts, to visit an aged Baptist there. They arrived on Saturday, July 19th, and the next day they worshiped together in his private house, in other words, in the man that they went to visit. While Mr. Clark was preaching, 2 constables entered the house with a warrant to arrest certain erroneous persons being strangers. The 3 ministers were carried off at once to the tavern and were notified that they must attend worship at the parish church in the afternoon. So they couldn't do it in private, they had to go to the accepted church gathering. They protested, saying that if they were forced into the meeting house, they would be obliged to dissent from the service. The constable told them that was nothing to him. He was ordered to bring them to church, and to church they must go. As they entered the meeting house, the congregation was at prayers, and the 3 prisoners took off their hats. But as soon as the prayer was over, they put on their hats again and began reading in their seats. The officers were ordered to take off their hats again. The following Tuesday, they were taken to Boston and put in prison. July 31st, they were tried before the Court of Assistants and were fined. Clark, 20 pounds, Holmes, 30, and John Crandall, 5, or each to be well whipped. Apparently Holmes did not pay his fine, for he described his experience of being whipped in a letter to a friend. He had attempted to speak to the spectators before his whipping, but was silenced. Here are his words. As the man began to lay the strokes upon my back, I said to the people, Though my flesh should fail and my spirit should fail, yet God would not fail. So it pleased the Lord to come in, and to fill my heart and tongue as a vessel full. And with an audible voice I break forth, praying the Lord not to lay this sin to their charge, and telling the people that now I found he did not fail me, and therefore now I should trust him forever, who failed me not. For in truth, as the strokes fell upon me, I had such a spiritual manifestation of God's presence as I never had before, and the outward pain was so removed from me that I could well bear it. Yea, and in a manner felt it not, although it was grievous, as the spectators said, the man striking with all his strength, spitting in his hand 3 times, with a 3-corded whip, giving me therewith 30 strokes. When he had loosed me from the post, having joyfulness in my heart and cheerfulness in my countenance, as the spectators observed, I told the magistrates, You have struck me with roses, and said, moreover, Although the Lord hath made it easy to me, yet I pray God it may not be laid to your charge. When the whipping was over, 2 men, John Hazel and John Spur, went up to the suffering man and shook hands with him, Hazel not speaking anything at all, and Spur simply saying, Blessed be the Lord. Yet both were fined 40 shillings, with the choice of paying the fine or being whipped. They both refused to pay the fine, but a friend paid Spur's, and after imprisonment for a week, another paid Hazel's. The whipping of Holmes was 30 lashes with a 3-thonged whip of knotted cord, wielded with both hands, and was so severe that when taken back to prison, his lacerated body could not bear to touch the bed. For many days he was compelled to rest, propped up on his hands and knees. So that's what they did to Baptists. Then there were things against Quakers. The Boston General Court, Anti-Quaker Law, 1656 to 1568. It is hereby further ordered and enacted that what Quaker soever shall arrive in this country from foreign parts, or shall come into this jurisdiction from any parts adjacent, shall be forthwith committed to the house of correction, and at their entrance to be severely whipped, and by the master thereof be kept constantly to work, and none suffered to converse or speak with them during the time of their imprisonment, which shall be no longer than necessity requires. So they could decide how long. And it is hereby further enacted that if any persons within this colony shall take upon them to defend the heretical opinions of the Quakers, or any of their books or papers, shall be fined for the first time 40 shillings. If they shall persist in the same, and shall again defend it the second time, 4 pounds. If, notwithstanding, they again defend and maintain the said Quakers' heretical opinions, they shall be committed to the house of correction until there be convenient passage to send them out of the land, being sentenced by the court of assistance to banishment. Every such person, upon conviction before the said court of assistance, in manner aforesaid, shall be committed to close prison for 1 month, and then, unless they choose voluntarily to depart this jurisdiction, shall give bond for their good behavior, and appear at the next court, continuing obstinate, and refusing to retract and reform the aforesaid opinions, they shall be sentenced to banishment upon pain of death. And any one magistrate, upon information given him of any such person, shall cause him to be apprehended, and shall commit any such person to prison, according to his discretion, until he come to trial as aforesaid. In 1657, 2 young people, Daniel Southwick and Provided Southwick, son and daughter of Lawrence and Cassandra Southwick, absenting themselves from the public ordinances, were fined by the courts of Salem and Ipswich. Apparently they could not pay the fines and were sold by the county treasurer. Their parents and older brother, Joseph, were also arrested and sent to Boston to be dealt with. There they were whipped and sent to jail without a trial, and their cattle were seized and sold to pay the fines that were laid on them. They were arrested and jailed a second time along with some other Quakers and kept without food for 5 days. They were whipped and tortured in various ways during that time. One of them, William Brend, was whipped multiple times so cruelly that the local townspeople finally rushed to the jail and rescued him and demanded that the barbaric jailer should be brought to justice. A certain Reverend John Norton stepped forward in defense of the jailer's actions, and he was not only justified but was told to continue and increase the whippings for all the prisoners. They were sentenced to banishment but had nowhere to go, and all their possessions had been taken from them. The aged couple, the Southwicks, died soon after from starvation. Humphrey Norton, merely passing through Southold on his way to one of the Dutch plantations, was apprehended without being asked whither he was going, and committed to the marshal, conveyed to New Haven, and there cast into prison, chained to a post, and none suffered to visit him in the bitter cold winter. At length he was had before the court, where was their priest, which was their minister, John Davenport, to whom Humphrey Norton had sent some religious queries, and the priest having spoken what he pleased in answer to those queries, Humphrey attempted to reply, but was prevented by their tying a great iron key across his mouth, so that he could not speak. After that he was had again to prison, and after 10 days more sentenced to be severely whipped, and burned in the hand with the letter H for heresy, and to be sent out of the colony, and not to return upon pain of the utmost penalty they could inflict by law, and to pay £10 toward the charge of the court and colony. And they ordered this sentence to be executed the same day. Accordingly, the drum was beat, and the people gathered. The poor man was fetched and stripped to the waist, and set with his back toward the magistrates, and had given in their view 36 cruel stripes, and then turned, and his face set toward them, his hand made fast in the stocks where they had set his body before, and burned very deep with a red-hot iron. Then he was sent to prison again, and there kept till a Dutchman, a stranger to him, paid down 20 nobles for his fine and fees. It was remarkable that as soon as he had suffered this cruel sentence, and was let loose from the stocks, he knelt down and prayed to the Lord, to the astonishment of his persecutors. Now we have the Boston Martyrs. They're probably a little better known among some of the situations that came about there. William Robinson, Marmaduke Stevenson, Nicholas Davis, and Mary Dyer came to Boston in 1659. They were arrested in September and sentenced to banishment on pain of death. But William Robinson, being looked upon as a teacher, was also condemned to be whipped severely, and the constable was commanded to get an able man to do it. Robinson was brought into the street and there stripped, and having his hands put through the holes of a carriage of a great gun, where the jailer held him, the executioner gave him 20 stripes with a 3-fold cord whip. Then he and the other prisoners were released and banished. Mary Dyer and Nicholas Davis left that jurisdiction temporarily, but Robinson and Stevenson went to Salem and other nearby areas to visit and build up their friends in the faith. But it was not long before they were arrested again and imprisoned in chains. In the next month, Mary Dyer returned and was taken into custody. On the 20th of October, these three were brought into court. John Endicott commanded the keeper to pull off their hats, and then said that they had made several laws to keep the Quakers from amongst them, and neither whipping nor imprisonment nor cutting off ears nor banishment upon pain of death would keep them from amongst them. He said that the court did not desire the death of any of them, yet his following words without more ado were, "Give ear and hearken to your sentence of death." Robinson and Stevenson were hanged on October 27th, but Mary Dyer was granted a reprieve and banished again. She returned in May of the next year. She was arrested again, and this time the death sentence was carried out. She was hanged on June 1st, 1660. Another Quaker, William Ledra, was hanged March 14th, 1661. By now, public opinion was against the persecution of the Quakers, so people were kind of realizing that this was not a good thing. Another Quaker, Wenlock Christensen, was tried and condemned to be hanged, but the judge, Governor John Endicott, knew that Christian could not be guarded securely enough to get him from the dungeon to the gallows. The people would not allow it. The court came up with another, humaner policy in order to accomplish the same purpose. The Vagabond Act was passed May 22, 1661, by which it was enacted that any person convicted before a county magistrate of being an undomiciled or vagabond Quaker was to be stripped naked to the middle, tied to the cart's tail, and flogged from town to town to the border. The first victim of this new and humaner law was Joseph Southwick, we had mentioned him earlier, who returned from banishment in 1661. At the trial, Endicott told him that they had made the new law to save his life in mercy to him. He inquired whether it were not as good to take his life now as to whip him after their manner 12 or 14 times on the cart's tail through their towns and then put him to death afterward. He was sentenced to be flogged through Boston, Roxbury, and Dedham. They tied him to a cart and lashed him for 15 miles. And while he sang to the praise of God, his tormentor swung with all his might a tremendous 2-handed whip whose knotted thongs were made of twisted catgut. Thence he was carried 15 miles from any town into the wilderness, and there they left him. In the middle of the winter of 1661 and 62, a Quaker woman, Elizabeth Houghton, was subjected to the same torture, being whipped through Cambridge, Watertown, and Dedham. Another anti-Quaker law. Every Quaker that comes into this jurisdiction shall be severely whipped and be kept at work in the house of correction. The second time be branded in one hand and kept at work as aforesaid. The third time be branded in the other hand, and the fourth time to be bored through the tongue with a red-hot iron. You can see they were not tolerant at all. The regulation adopted by the early colonists of permitting only members of the church to vote or to hold office in the civil government led to the most pernicious results. This measure had been accepted as a means of preserving the purity of the state, but it resulted in the corruption of the church. A profession of religion being the condition of suffrage and office holding, many, actuated solely by motives of worldly policy, united with the church without a change of heart. Thus the churches came to consist to a considerable extent of unconverted persons, and even in the ministry were those who not only held errors of doctrine, but who were ignorant of the renewing power of the Holy Spirit. Thus again was demonstrated the evil results so often witnessed in the history of the church from the days of Constantine to the present, of attempting to build up the church by the aid of the state, of appealing to the secular power in support of the gospel of him who declared, "My kingdom is not of this world," John 18:36. The union of the church with the state, be the degree ever so slight, while it may appear to bring the world nearer to the church, does in reality but bring the church nearer to the world. In 1643, the New England Confederation was formed between Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven colonies. Its primary purpose was to unite the Puritan colonies in support of the church and for defense against the Indians. Rhode Island was refused admission because of its principles of liberty of conscience. But in 1657, Massachusetts begged Rhode Island to join the Confederacy in an effort to save New England from the Quakers, to preserve the whole body of colonists against such a pest. But Roger Williams was still president of Rhode Island, and true to his principles, he replied, "We have no law amongst us whereby to punish any for only declaring by words their minds and understandings concerning things and ways of God as to salvation and our eternal condition. As for these Quakers, we find that where they are most of all suffered to declare themselves freely and only opposed by arguments and discourse, there they least of all desire to come. Any breach of the civil law shall be punished, but the freedom of different consciences shall be respected." This reply enraged the whole Confederacy. Massachusetts threatened to prevent any trade of Rhode Island. In this predicament, Roger Williams appealed for protection to Cromwell, who now ruled England. His appeal described the case as it was, but included this plea: "Whatever fortune may befall, let us not be compelled to exercise any civil power over men's consciences." The Quakers finally had somewhat of a refuge when William Penn, a Quaker himself, founded the province of Pennsylvania, March 4th, 1681. There was a certain degree of religious freedom, but since the Charter of Privileges extended religious freedom to those who confess and acknowledge one almighty and eternal God to be the creator, upholder, and ruler of the world, and government was initially open only to such as possess faith in Jesus Christ, the religious environment would more accurately be termed toleration. Protection from compulsory religious observances was guaranteed to no one. There were laws stating that people shall abstain from their common daily labor, that they may the better dispose themselves to worship God according to their understandings. So they were giving freedom of conscience to those who professed Christianity, but if you didn't have that liberty. Here is A.T. Jones' commentary on this issue. Throughout this whole period, we find that in all the discussions and all the work of the professed champions of the rights of conscience, there everywhere appears the fatal defect that it was only their own rights of conscience that they either asserted or defended. In other words, their argument simply amounted to this: it is our inalienable right to believe and worship as we choose. it is likewise our inalienable right to compel everybody else to believe and worship as we choose. But this is no assertion at all of the rights of conscience. The true principle and assertion of the rights of conscience is not our assertion of our right to believe and worship as we choose. This always leaves the way open for the additional assertion of our right to compel others to believe and worship as we choose, should occasion seem to demand, and there are a multitude of circumstances that are ever ready strongly to urge that occasion does demand. The true principle and the right assertion of the rights of conscience is our assertion of every other man's right to believe and worship as he chooses, or not to worship at all if he chooses. This at once sweeps away every excuse and every argument that might ever be offered for the restriction or the invasion of the rights of conscience by any person or any power. Nor was it alone in New England that church and state were united. It was so to a greater or less extent in every one of the 13 original colonies in America, except Rhode Island. In New England, the established religion was Congregationalism, while in all the colonies south from New York to Georgia, except only Pennsylvania, the Church of England was the favored one. In Pennsylvania, there was no union with any particular denomination as such, but no one could hold office or even vote except such as possess faith in Jesus Christ. And protection from compulsory religious observances was guaranteed to no one, except those who confess and acknowledge one almighty and eternal God to be the creator, upholder, and ruler of the world. As all were thus required to be religious and to possess faith in Jesus Christ, it was therefore required that according to the good example of the primitive Christians, every first day of the week, called the Lord's Day, people shall abstain from their common daily labor, that they may the better dispose themselves to worship God according to their understandings. Maryland, while held by the Roman Catholics, was freer than any other colony except Rhode Island. Yet even there, as in Pennsylvania, it was only toleration that was guaranteed, and that only to persons professing to believe in Jesus Christ. But in 1692, the Episcopalians took possession, and although other forms of religion were still tolerated, Protestant episcopacy was established by law and so continued until the Revolution. Here we have President William Taft giving his commentary on this. We speak with great satisfaction of the fact that our ancestors came to this country to establish freedom of religion. Well, if you are to be exact, they came to establish freedom for their own religion and not the freedom of anybody else's religion. The truth is that in those days, such a thing as freedom of religion was not understood. Then came the American Revolution, overturning all the principles of the papacy and establishing for the enlightenment of all nations the new republic, the first national government upon the earth that accords with the principles announced by Jesus Christ for mankind and for civil government. And these are the verses I mentioned at the beginning. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And my kingdom is not of this world. And this was an interesting thought to me. The American Revolution did not consist in the establishment of a government independent of Great Britain. I always thought they fought to get Great Britain out. But, Jones goes on to say here, but in the ideas concerning man and government that were proclaimed and established by it, the Revolution is the expression of two distinct ideas. First, that government is of the people, and second, that government is of right entirely separate from religion. So there's some interesting things to ponder. It was demonstrated that the principles of the Bible are the surest safeguards of national greatness. The feeble and isolated colonies grew to a confederation of powerful states, and the world marked with wonder the peace and prosperity of a church without a pope and a state without a king. And so they had the Declaration of Independence and various other documents. Most of the colonies that later became the original 13 states had an established religion. When it was proposed to organize a federal government, one of the significant concerns of the colonies was that the national power might override the powers and interfere with the domestic affairs of the states. Since their religion and the free exercise of it were so important to them, in other words, each state had its religion, and they didn't want the national government interfering, They wanted to guarantee that the national government could not infringe on that freedom by enacting laws which would restrict or prohibit the free exercise of the religion of any of the people of any of the states, or by recognizing or favoring one religion above another. This is what led to the adoption of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association, and he said some things that have been brought down to our time. Speaking of the wall of separation, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. And then from the U.S. Senate in 1822, they had a document that they sent out called the Sunday Mail Report, and it said this: "It is not the legitimate province of the legislature to determine what religion is true or what false. Our government is a civil and not a religious institution. Our Constitution recognizes in every person the right to choose his own religion and to enjoy it freely without molestation. Whatever may be the religious sentiments of citizens, and however variant, they are alike entitled to protection from the government, so long as they do not invade the rights of others." And here's an interesting quote from Benjamin Franklin: "When religion is good, it will take care of itself. When it is not able to take care of itself, and God does not see fit to take care of it, so that it has to appeal to the civil power for support, it is evidence to my mind that its cause is a bad one." Interesting thought. Almost from the beginning, this irreligious wall between the church and the state was criticized by various church leaders. Early in 1863, the Civil War had not been going well for the North. Distressed over the terrible disaster his troops had suffered at Fredericksburg in December, General Ambrose Burnside had just stepped down as commander of the Army of the Potomac. Interpreting the Union defeats as a manifestation of divine wrath, clergymen representing 11 Protestant denominations met at Xenia, Ohio on February 4, 1863, seeking ways to appease an angry God. Why was God angry with the United States? According to this association's spokesman, the reason was the failure of its government to acknowledge the lordship of Jesus Christ and to enforce his moral law. This group, the Christian Amendment Association, later renamed the National Reform Association, proposed an amendment to the preamble of the U.S. Constitution. The original draft of the amendment by Pennsylvania attorney John Alexander read, "We, the people of the United States," and in the white type here we have their addition, "recognizing the being and attributes of Almighty God, the divine authority of the Holy Scriptures, the law of God as the paramount rule, and Jesus the Messiah, the Savior and Lord of all," and then it goes on with the original, "in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for," and they wanted to strike out the common defense, "promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So they wanted to add that in there so that we became a Christian nation. Now there's various groups that were formed during this time in the time around the Civil War and afterwards. The National Reform Association was 1864. I'll just read a few things here that they said. One of their leaders said, "We might add in all justice, if the opponents of the Bible do not like our government and its Christian features, let them go to some wild, desolate land, and in the name of the devil, and for the sake of the devil, subdue it, and set up a government of their own on infidel and atheistic ideas, and then, if they can stand it, stay there till they die." The Prohibition Party was founded in 1869. They were trying to outlaw intoxicating liquor, but they worked very closely with the NRA, and they have a few things to say. I'm just going to read what's in the white type there just to save a little bit of time. The voice of the Church of Christ will be heard and respected. So they were trying to get Christians to speak out in government and have an authority there. When the harmonious judgment of the people of God in America upon the issues of temperance, purity, and uprightness shall be received with respect and enacted into laws. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was organized in 1873, and they worked closely with the other organizations. One of their leaders said this in 1887, "When we get women and Christ in politics, and they will both go in together, we shall have every reform, and Christ will be proclaimed King of Kings and Lord of Lords." I thought that was interesting. When we get women and Christ in politics, what are we getting right now? A little farther down there in white, that Christ shall be this world's king of its courts, its camps, its commerce, king of its colleges and cloisters, king of its customs and its constitutions. The kingdom of Christ must enter the realm of law through the gateway of politics. So they were getting quite outspoken. Another group that was formed was the American Sabbath Union. And one of their leaders said, "The merchants of Tyre insisted upon selling goods near the temple on Sabbath." And this story is in the book of Nehemiah, I think. "And Nehemiah compelled the officers of the law to do their duty and stop it. So we can compel the officers of the law to do their duty. When the Church of God awakens and does its duty on one side and the state on the other, we shall have no further trouble in this matter." And then the author, A.T. Jones, comments on that. He says, "Yes, we all know how it was before. The gentle Albigenses of the south of France greatly disturbed the church. They refused to obey her commands. But the church was wide awake, for Innocent II was pope, and with the command, 'Up, most Christian king, up, and aid us in our work of vengeance,' he saw to it that the state was awake on the other side. Then, with the church awake to its duty on one side and the state on the other, the Albigenses were blotted from the earth, and there was no further trouble in that matter." At one of the meetings of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, a certain Dr. McAllister said, I'm just going to read the white type there, "They may hold any other day of the week as sacred and observe it, but the day which is the one day in 7 for the nation at large, let that not be publicly desecrated by anyone." So he's basically saying it doesn't matter what day you want to keep, you will observe the first day of the week. How did the Catholic Church relate to this? In 1886, a Catholic priest was asked, "What is your church going to do with the religious amendment movement? Are you going to help it forward? Are you going to vote for it?" "Oh," said the priest, "we have nothing to do with that. We leave that to the Protestants. We let them do all that. They're coming to us, and we only have to wait." And then one of the members of the American Sabbath Union sent a letter to Cardinal Gibbons, the Archbishop of Baltimore, asking him to join hands with them in petitioning Congress to pass the bill for the enactment of a national law to promote the observance of Sunday as a day for religious worship. The cardinal promptly announced himself as most happy to do so. President John Adams had this to say, "Nothing is more dreaded than the national government meddling with religion." Okay, just over 100 years ago, a law in Virginia, 1910. The Sunday law of Virginia, while imposing a fine of not less than $5 upon anyone found laboring at any trade or calling on a Sabbath, contains a very plainly worded exemption for observers of the seventh day. Section 3800 of the Code provides that any person who conscientiously believes that the seventh day of the week ought to be observed as a Sabbath, and actually refrains from all secular business and labor on that day, shall not be liable to the penalties prescribed in the preceding section imposing the fine. Such a provision, it would seem, ought to guarantee any conscientious observer of the seventh day against molestation for doing ordinary labor on Sunday, if such guarantee can exist where Sunday laws exist. but that it does not always do so was strikingly illustrated by an incident which occurred at Colonial Beach in October of 1910. So the law said if you're a Sabbath keeper, you don't need to worry too much about this Sunday law. But Mr. Eugene Ford, a Christian observer of the seventh day, was requested by his employer, an observer of Sunday, to do a small job at work for him on Sunday, October 10th, repairing some dredging machines which had been left at his shop for that purpose. The owners of the machines called for them on Sunday, but little work was required to complete the repairs, and Mr. Ford was asked to do it, notwithstanding that it was a Sunday. He did the work, and the machines were taken away. There were involved in the transaction the owners of the machines, the driver of the dray, the employer, Mr. Staples, and Mr. Ford. All were nominal observers of Sunday except the last named, which was Mr. Ford, who, having conscientiously observed as Sabbath the previous day, considered himself at liberty to work on Sunday. Living in the place, however, was one whose ideas of liberty and justice seemed tinctured with religious prejudice. This man, though a professed observer of Sunday and a teacher in a Methodist Sunday school, had, during the summer, it was alleged by neighbors, sold and delivered crab meat and gasoline on Sunday. Nevertheless, having learned that Mr. Ford had been working on Sunday, he swore out a warrant for his arrest for violation of the Sunday law. The latter was tried before the mayor of the town and fined $2 and costs, the amount prescribed by the law previous to its amendment in 1908. This Mr. Ford refused to pay and appealed to the county court. His employer, however, came forward and paid the fine, and the case was dismissed. It should be noted that although several others were involved in this transaction, no one was arrested save this observer of the seventh day. That the prosecutor himself, a Mr. Ernest Ford, though not a relative, had violated the law earlier in the season, and this without any warrant of an exemption to cover his case, that the same law imposing the fine exempted observers of another day, and lastly, that the prosecutor admitted that he would not cause the arrest on anyone for Sunday work except an observer of the seventh day, all of which demonstrates anew the fact that religious liberty cannot be guaranteed in any land where religion or religious observances are made matters of law. Now, a few quotes here from the Pen of Inspiration. In the movements now in progress in the United States to secure for the institutions and usages of the Church the support of the state, Protestants are following in the steps of Papists. Nay, more, they are opening the door for the papacy to regain in Protestant America the supremacy which she has lost in the Old World. Protestants will work upon the rulers of the land to make laws to restore the lost ascendancy of the man of sin who sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Roman Catholic principles will be taken under the care and protection of the state. The agencies of evil are combining their forces and consolidating. They are strengthening for the last great crisis. Great changes are soon to take place in our world, and the final movements will be rapid ones. So, what kind of movements are in progress? I've got a few news items here that have showed up in the last few years. Just for interest's sake, I'll have to go through these quite quickly. I'll just be reading the white letters, the white words here. Pope John Paul II, in his encyclical Dies Domini, says Christians will naturally strive to ensure that civil legislation respects their duty to keep Sunday holy. So that's calling for a Sunday law. Then a little bit farther down, Christians in respect of religious freedom and of the common good of all should seek to have Sundays and the Church's holy days recognized as legal holidays. Here from the Catholic News Agency, 2016, a Jesuit was appointed the head of the U.S. Religious Freedom Commission. It's interesting who they would choose for that. I got a couple of little items here on the Jesuits. Here's a quote from Marquis de Lafayette, the French statesman and general who served with George Washington in the Revolutionary War. He said, "It is my opinion that if the liberties of this country, the United States of America, are destroyed, it will be by the subtlety of the Roman Catholic Jesuit priests. for they are the most crafty, dangerous enemies to civil and religious liberty. They have instigated most of the wars of Europe. And this from The Great Controversy. Under various disguises, the Jesuits worked their way into offices of state, climbing up to be the counselors of kings and shaping the policy of nations. They became servants to act as spies upon their masters. They established colleges for the sons of princes and nobles and schools for the common people. The Jesuits rapidly spread themselves over Europe, and wherever they went, there followed a revival of popery. Now here on the website of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities, they have a few statistics, and they're quite proud of them. Their website reveals that there are 27 Jesuit colleges and universities in the United States with 22,000 faculty members, more than 215,000 students, and 2 million graduates. 55 of the members in the current Congress are alumni of Jesuit institutions. One is a member of the Supreme Court, and more than 30 are in the presidential administration on Capitol Hill. This was before Donald Trump was elected back in 2016 during his campaign. He was encouraging religious leaders. He said, "I'm going to take this into my own hands and I'm going to figure a way that we can get you back your freedom of speech," he told evangelical pastors. "It will be so great for the evangelicals, for the pastors, for the ministers, for the priests, and for America." Here's a news note from LifeSite, also 2016. The writer in this article asks, "Is Trump the new Constantine?" And he gives a little bit of a history here, describing what things were like back in the Roman Empire in Constantine's time. And then he comments that Trump would be just like Constantine and give everyone the right to practice their faith. I'm reading in the middle there, the white words, giving Christians the right to practice their faith and speak freely. Conservative Christians have the solutions to many of these problems, but cannot articulate them freely in the public square due to the endemic political correctness and cultural Marxism. And then the very last line there, Donald Trump is the only person who can give us that freedom. Oh, how a growing Christian movement is seeking to change America. And it talks a little bit about a movement where they are trying to get Christians into leadership and promote the Christian agenda in the government. And it all sounds good. I had the news article, but it's not showing up here right now. But if you go to this website, The Conversation, October 11th, 2017, you might find that news article there. Now, in 2018, there was a news note here about an Amish community where they are pushing the Amish into doing things that are against their conscience. And I just got a little bit here on that. They're enforcing a building code that requires certain kinds of plumbing and everything. And then because of that requirement, the Amish would be also required to connect to the electrical grid, and they have conscientious qualms against those things, but they're being forced to do it anyway. Vatican News, 2018, U.S. Embassy to the Holy See hosts symposium on religious freedom. And here's some of the things that were said. I'll just read the white print. In the midst of the many situations which challenge the right to freedom of religion and conscience, the Catholic Church encourages all people of goodwill to continue to raise awareness in order to allow members of various religious communities to enjoy freedom of religion fully and to profess freely and publicly their faith in every part of the world. And that sounds very good. They're promoting religious freedom, but as we go on here, we might see a different side. Mike Pompeo, the Trump administration making a clarion call for religious freedom around the world. So again, freedom, religious freedom. Here, Secretary of State says Catholic Church has a central role in the fight for religious freedom. Pence and Pompeo make big religious freedom pledges. And here's a few statements from that particular article. The Potomac Declaration, which proclaims religious freedom to be a far-reaching, universal, and profound human right that all peoples and nations of goodwill must defend around the globe. And they go on to talk about all of that, and that all sounds really good. But again, we have other factors going on. Here is the U.S. Supreme Court. At least 5 justices are Roman Catholics, 3 are Jewish. And then a little note at the bottom there, it is unclear whether Neil Gorsuch considers himself a Catholic or an Episcopalian. Regardless, they're quite biased in some of their ideas. This is during Trump's presidency now. Evangelicals' puzzling devotion to Donald Trump. And the article includes some things like this. Trump is like St. Paul, who, though he murdered Christians, went on to minister to many, many people. I think he's being molded by God for the role. The author of the article says that. Here's another news article. Kenneth Copeland on Trump's state dinner. It was like a really anointed church service. President Trump had a dinner for a bunch of religious leaders, and here's what some of what was going on there. Trump promised the pastors and ministry leaders present that the government's attacks on faith communities are over. And Kenneth Copeland says he could sense the Spirit of God in that place. He says the most significant thing about Trump's presidency is that he is doing things led by the Spirit of God. And then when someone in the room asked Trump what he wanted to be remembered for, Copeland says, the president responded, I want to be remembered as the president who prayed more than any other. Sounds good. Here, talking about a movie called The Chosen One that talks about Trump's election, and some of the comments in this news article. It was, everyone agreed, a miracle. The unexpected election of Donald Trump in 2016 was an act of God, who chose the philandering billionaire and reality TV star to restore America's moral values. And down at the bottom, the white print, Trump's election was God's divine will. Trump's victory was the result of divine intervention. Okay. Here's what President George Washington had to say. The United States of America should have a foundation free from the influence of clergy. Breitbart, 2019. Pope Francis tells Christians not to try to convert non-believers. And he goes on and tells, he's speaking to a bunch of high school students, basically tells them, don't try to convert people that aren't already Christians. True disciples of Jesus did not proselytize. Again, I'm reading the white print. The gospel is never, ever advanced through proselytism. Proselytism is not the way. The church does not grow by proselytism. Never exclude someone because they have another faith. Here was a news article that was mentioned on the website adventmessenger.org where an Adventist leader was signing an ecumenical charter that affirms faith in one holy Catholic Apostolic Church. This happened January 25th, 2020. A historical ecumenical charter was signed by Seventh-day Adventists, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, and it mentions a whole bunch of different religions there. The signing ceremony took place in the San Paolo Maggiore Roman Catholic Church in Bologna, Italy. The document that was signed is a pledge of commitment to each other. Adventists pledged a commitment to Rome, and Rome reciprocated that commitment. Make no mistake, the churches that signed this document promised to uphold the principles of the ecumenical charter, which includes affirming an allegiance to each other. Now, here are some Roman Catholic sentiments regarding religious liberty. This comes from a book by Josiah Strong, which Ellen White quoted him in the book Great Controversy. So I went back to his original book and got these quotes from his book. The pacific tone of Rome in the United States does not imply a change of heart. She is tolerant where she is helpless. Says Bishop O'Connor, religious liberty is merely endured until the opposite can be carried into effect without peril to the Catholic world. The Catholic Review says Protestantism of every form has not and never can have any right where Catholicity is triumphant. The following is from The Rambler, a Catholic paper of London. Religious liberty, in the sense of liberty possessed by every man to choose his religion, is one of the most wicked delusions ever foisted upon this age by the father of all deceit. The very name of liberty, except in the sense of a permission to do certain definite acts, ought to be banished from the domain of religion. It is neither more nor less than falsehood. No man has a right to choose his religion. Back up here. President Abraham Lincoln says, I see a very dark cloud on America's horizon, and that cloud is coming from Rome. I'll go on here. This is a very brief history of some ancient religious liberty issues. Of course, during the years 303 to about 311 AD, Diocletian was the emperor of Rome, and he was persecuting severely. And then in 311, the Edict of Toleration, also known as the Edict of Serdica, was brought in by Galerius, and it's implicitly granted Christianity the status of religio licita, a worship recognized and accepted by the Roman Empire. It was the first edict legalizing Christianity, preceding the Edict of Milan by 2 years. So 2 years later came the Edict of Milan, which permanently established religious toleration for Christianity within the Roman Empire. But within 8 years, we have Constantine's Sunday Law, 321. On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. You're probably familiar with that, so I won't read the rest. That was in 321, and about 40 years later, the Canon 29 of the Synod of Laodicea said, Christians must not Judaize by resting on the Sabbath, but must work on that day. So at first, they were told they should go to church on Sunday. Later, you shall not go to church on Sabbath. How shall we then live? What are we supposed to do? Here are a few quotes and verses. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding forth the word of life. And from Matthew 10, you shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. But when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what you shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour what you shall speak. For it is not you that speak, but the Spirit of your Father which speaketh in you. He that endureth to the end shall be saved. And in the story of Daniel, they were looking for something to accuse Daniel of. In Daniel chapter 6, then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So they made a religious law. Here are some quotes from the pen of inspiration. Teach the people to conform in all things to the laws of their state when they can do so without conflicting with the law of God. There should be a constant walking in all humility. We should not feel it enjoined upon us to irritate our neighbors who idolize Sunday by making determined efforts to bring labor on that day before them purposely to exhibit an independence. Our sisters need not select Sunday as the day to exhibit their washing. There should be no noisy demonstration. Let us consider how fearful and terribly sad is the delusion that has taken the world captive, and by every means in our power seek to enlighten those who are our bitterest enemies. The Sunday movement is now making its way in darkness. The leaders are concealing the true issue, and many who unite in the movement do not themselves see whither the undercurrent is tending. Its professions are mild and apparently Christian, but when it shall speak, it will reveal the spirit of the dragon. It is our duty to do all in our power to avert the threatened danger. We should endeavor to disarm prejudice by placing ourselves in a proper light before the people. We should bring before them the real question at issue, thus interposing the most effectual protest against measures to restrict liberty of conscience. We should search the Scriptures and be able to give the reason for our faith. Says the prophet, the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. Ever we need to manifest kindness and true courtesy. We may have to plead most earnestly before legislative councils for the right to exercise independent judgment, to worship God according to the dictates of our conscience. Thus, in his providence, God has designed that the claims of his holy law shall be brought before men in the highest authority. But as we do all we can, as men and women who are not ignorant of Satan's devices, we are to manifest no bitterness of feeling. Constantly, we are to offer prayer for divine aid. It is God alone who can hold the four winds until the angels shall seal the servants of God in their foreheads. The commandment-keeping people of God will ere long be placed in a most trying position. But all those who have walked in the light and have diffused the light will realize that God interposes in their behalf. When everything looks most forbidding, then the Lord will reveal his power to his faithful ones. When the nation for which God has worked in such a marvelous manner and over which he has spread the shield of omnipotence abandons Protestant principles and through its legislature gives countenance and support to Romanism in limiting religious liberty, then God will work in his own power for his people who are true. The tyranny of Rome will be exercised, but Christ is our refuge. And here we have Martin Luther's famous statement, "Unless I am convicted by Scripture and plain reason, I do not accept the authority of popes and councils, for they have contradicted each other. My conscience is captive to the word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, for to go against conscience is neither right nor safe. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen." Christians should be preparing for what is soon to break upon the world as an overwhelming surprise. And this preparation they should make by, and there's two main points here, by diligently studying the Word of God and striving to conform their lives to its precepts. The tremendous issues of eternity demand of us something besides an imaginary religion, a religion of words and forms where truth is kept in the outer court. God calls for a revival and a reformation. But of the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I write to you, for yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, Peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them, as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. But you, brethren, are not in darkness, that day should overtake you as a thief. You are all children of light, and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep, as do others, but let us watch and be sober.